So it's no secret that the price of nearly everything has gone up in the last few years, but how does it compare with the advancement of wages in the United States? Today we're going to talk about the increase in cost of housing and cars, primarily as it relates to wages, but we'll also talk about a few other categories that have advanced in cost as well. So back in September, I got a question from a viewer asking about the differences between housing and vehicle prices compared to wages over the last 20 years. And I thought it was a very intriguing question, and since I'm always interested in what viewers want to see, I decided to make a video about it. In this video, we'll look at data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to see how wages have paced in recent years as compared to homes, cars, and a few other common items we purchase. Since the original question I received was inquiring about the changes in the price of houses and cars relative to wages, we'll start there. Again, all this information comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have a relatively user-friendly data finder in case you ever want to do a little digging of your own. And you'll see in this graph I've included data for the cost of housing and cars as compared to overall inflation and increases in wages since 2001. Now, for those of you who prefer the hard numbers instead of a graph, here's a little table that'll also help you see the data. If you've been trying to buy a home in the last 24 years or so and it feels like you're having trouble keeping up with the housing market, I'm afraid it's not your imagination. Housing is not just outpacing wage growth, it's been outpacing it by about 1.4% in that time. This may not seem like a lot, but when you annualize that number, it means the cost of housing has increased 32.67% faster than wages. Put another way, each dollar spent for housing in 2001 would only carry you 75% as far as it will in 2024. Now, the silver lining here is that wages have just managed to outpace inflation in that period, and believe it or not, your money will go further if you buy a car in 2024 than it would in 2001. Now, I don't really have much of an explanation for this. Clearly, there was an automotive pricing bump during the pandemic, but I was a bit surprised to see the relative steadiness in the pricing of cars. Now, another thing that stands out to me in this chart is the near linear path each of these categories seems to follow until the world came unglued in 2020. To take a closer look at that, let's zoom in on the last 4 or 5 years and see the impact they've had on this data and also how prices have changed in a couple of other categories. So I'll spare you a historic summary of the last 5 years. From just a financial standpoint, they were traumatic enough without getting into the geopolitical issues that have been going on. But as you know, we've seen dramatic inflation that has served to reshape the way we approach the purchase of certain items. Now, similar to the previous section about housing and cars, this graph shows changes in prices over time. In this case, we're looking at data only going back to 2020. Additionally, I've added groceries, college tuition, and prescription drugs to this review. And here's a table with the data annualized over this period. Now, personally, I chose groceries because I still can't believe how much I have to spend every time I go to the store. I also added tuition and prescription drugs because I thought that prices in those two categories advanced rapidly in the late 2010s. But I was really surprised to see the data I got from the Bureau of Labor Statistics about tuition, primarily because it doesn't look to have advanced as much as I thought it had. And data like this always drives me into a bit of a moral dilemma. Now, I know the cost of tuition in my home state of Alabama has increased at a much faster clip than 1.6% annually. Now, in a post I wrote for our website about 529 plans, I found data that indicated the cost of attendance in the United States has been increasing at the rate of 6.2% annually in the same time frame. So is the Bureau of Labor Statistics wrong? Well, in my opinion, the data I managed to pull was limited somehow to certain schools, students, or degree programs, or something. I would just toss it out and go looking for data that better supports the point of view I presented in my 529 post, but that seems a little dishonest. I'm only bringing it up anyway because I think you should draw your own conclusions, so let's just get back to the data. Now, as expected, groceries have gotten incredibly expensive. Trust me, I'm keenly aware. I have 2 kids that are barreling toward their teenage years, and their stomachs are not getting any smaller. The other not so shocking data point is housing. What I find most alarming about housing costs is the fact that the curve doesn't look to be losing any steam like cars or groceries have. You can at least see the lines on those beginning to plateau a bit. Also, the gap between wage growth and housing appears to be getting larger with time. Now, thankfully, this isn't the case with inflation and wages, which are trending back into balance as high interest rates continue to slow inflation. And while we're talking about wage data, the fact that wages continue to grow is incredibly beneficial in helping our country recover from the choppiness of the last several years. If inflation slowed but wages failed to grow, it would just prolong some of the economic headaches we've been experiencing. Now, thankfully, there's plenty of work available for Americans right now. Okay, so we've got the data, but where do we go from here? Well, for the most part, the inflation we've seen in recent years isn't all that different from other periods of inflation we've experienced historically, with a couple of key differences. First, wages have managed to keep pace for the most part, and they continue to grow. I don't think I can overstate how beneficial this is for our economy. Ultimately, productivity is the real force that drives the economy forward. Now, the other and bigger issue, in my opinion, is housing. Frankly, the diverging trend between wages and the cost of housing concerns me for a number of reasons. For one, this data includes both rents and ownership of housing. In both cases, housing is getting more and more difficult to afford. And unlike other common consumer categories like groceries and cars, there's much less flexibility in the cost of housing. From a financial perspective, home ownership is an effective way to lock down a major life expense. This is especially useful in retirement when income is typically lower and less flexible. The longer people have to rent or save in order to catch up to the market, the longer they're having to wait to tie down one of the largest living expenses they'll have in the entirety of their lives. Also, for most Americans, home equity is a central part of their net worth. Inflation and housing costs will help those who already have a home, but hurt those who don't. This trend will only serve to increase the gap between haves and have-nots, which seems particularly undesirable in a country that prides itself on providing opportunities for basically anyone to improve their standard of living. If you're among those who are striving to save so you can buy a home of your own, I'm afraid I don't have a magic wand that can reverse the trend of growing home prices. Now, I have been hopeful that higher interest rates would close the gap we talked about earlier between basically the cost of housing and wages. But just recently, the Fed announced that they're actually reducing interest rates by 50 basis points, or 0.5%, which is going to make borrowing easier, but it's going to probably drive the cost of housing back up again. If you're trying to save to buy a house, I'd encourage you to continue saving and maybe consider lowering your standards a bit so you can at least step into house ownership. That way, prices increase, it still benefits you some. Now, I hope you found this data interesting. I know I did, but I don't necessarily think you should change any of your financial behavior because of it. If you've been following our Next Dollar roadmap and you have an asset allocation that matches your goals, then don't panic. Just stay the course. Good financial plans are built with circumstances like these in mind. The storm will pass. Hold fast and keep up the good work. For more information about housing, expenses, debt, cash flow, investing, retirement, all those sorts of things, please check out martinmoney.com or the playlist, which I'll have linked down in the description below. As always, I'm grateful for your time and your interest in my videos. God bless and take care.